Welcome to a special episode of Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion on the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Litman. It's our annual Supreme Court review episode. The court's final flurry of opinions, handed down Friday, June 27th, capped a conservative juggernaut of a term in which the supermajority of 6 justices had their way in case after case and showed little interest in reaching any sort of common ground with the 3 more progressive justices. The opinion in Trump versus Casa disabled what to date has been the strongest means of combating Trump's series of outlandish and unlawful executive orders, namely nationwide injunctions by district courts. The 6 shut the door firmly on that ability and made clear that nationwide relief was their lookout. That suggests also an increased use of the shadow docket to grant emergency relief, which the court has abused flagrantly in recent years, and, given the pro-executive views of the 6, it also signals a far greater solicitude to the administration's claims for relief. Litigants who had successfully sought nationwide injunctions in district courts were left scrambling for new ways to secure broad relief, but the prospects looked cloudy at best. The radically conservative views of the 6 came through across the board. The court delivered 6-3 decisions for conservative causes in a range of hot-button social areas, including gender identity, religious exercise, and free speech. By term's end, Justices Sotomayor and Jackson were both signing their dissents with untraditional phrases such as, "In sadness, I dissent," or "With deep disillusionment, I dissent." To piece through the wreckage of a term in which the conservative supermajority had its way at nearly every turn, and may have laid much of the groundwork for Trump to impose an authoritarian government, we're very fortunate to welcome 3 of the very most knowledgeable scholars of the court in the country. And they are Leah Litman, a professor of law at the University of Michigan. Leah writes frequently about the court across a range of media outlets. She's a regular commentator on NPR and MSNBC. She received the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Award for her scholarly excellence from the American Constitution Society, and she is the author of Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes, which we discussed in a recent one-on-one episode in some depth. And of course, she co-hosts the podcast Strict Scrutiny along with another of our guests. In-depth genealogical research has yet to turn up evidence of any distant relation in the old country, but we continue to work on it. Welcome, no relation, Leah Litman.
Thanks for having me, no relation, Harry.
Melissa Murray, the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU, the Faculty Director of Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center, and a leading expert in family law, constitutional law, and reproductive rights and justice. She's an author of Cases on Reproductive Rights and Justice. She's also a prolific written commentator and a frequent guest and host, I should add, on media outlets, including MSNBC. And of course, a co-host along with Kate Shaw and Leah of the really great Supreme Court podcast, Strict Scrutiny. Thanks, as always, for joining, Melissa.
Thanks for having me.
And Steve Vladeck this is the one bad thing about his having gone from Texas, where he was Charles Allen Wright Chair, but he is now the Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Federal Courts at Georgetown University, contributor for The Contrarian, the Supreme Court analyst for CNN. His book, titled The Shadow Docket: How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic, was a New York Times bestseller and I think has proven very influential. His Substack, titled One First, a great Substack on the Supreme Court. Always a pleasure to welcome you, Steve.
Thanks, Harry. Great to be with you.
Even in an overly prolix way. All right, let's just cut to the damn chase with what, Steve, you called the obvious lead story, the birthright citizenship nationwide injunctions case. And as everyone knows by now, the court ruled that lower federal courts cannot impose nationwide injunctions except as necessary to provide complete relief to the parties before them. There's been this pretty remarkable division of opinion about the gravity and implications of the opinion. You in particular, Melissa, were involved in an early exchange with George Conway. I have the sense that the four of us are largely on the same page, but let's just start with an assessment. How important a decision, how large a cause of concern is the nationwide injunctions case?
Since you mentioned my exchange with George on MSNBC the day the decision was announced, Harry, I'll jump in. I do think it's really interesting how people think that women are like going off when they just disagree with a man. It's actually really interesting just to sort of observe the way people respond to that. But I will just sort of preface this with, on that television show, George made the statement that he didn't really think that the court's decision here was a very big deal because the court had left open the prospect of class action lawsuits as a vehicle for addressing these broad attacks on the rule of law. And to be very clear, I have nothing but respect for George, but I do think he is wrong. And I think he is not just wrong, he's loud and wrong on this particular issue. It is not the case that class actions are going to be an obvious panacea for what the court has done here. The universal injunction had a lot of issues. For your listeners, a universal injunction is when a court decides that the remedy that it provides will not just extend to the litigants who are immediately before it, but because of the nature of the violation, it is necessary to provide quote unquote universal relief to an entire group of people who might be affected, not just those litigants. And we have seen an uptick in universal injunctions, certainly since the 2000s. The Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration all complained of them. And I think one of the reasons why they have arisen with such increasing frequency is because Congress has really absented the field. Part of this is polarization. Just the inability to get legislation done means that you have an executive that is doing more with executive orders, but we are also in a moment where this particular executive is doing more than even his predecessors may have done with executive orders. And much of what he is doing raises real questions about its lawfulness and its constitutionality. And that, I think, provides a real need for a means of limiting the impact of those unlawful or unconstitutional decisions. And that is why I think you have seen the use of the nationwide injunction, the universal injunction with this particular president, despite those who view the court's interventions as excessive. That's basically what's going on here. And my point with George is we are in an unprecedented moment. This was the only remedy that lower courts had for checking a president, certainly in the absence of Congress stepping in to do so. And without that judicial remedy, we are basically in a situation where there is an emboldened and aggressive executive exerting authority in ways that are absolutely unprecedented, and we now have no way to stop it. The class action, maybe that could work, but I think it's unlikely. One, states cannot be parties to class actions. Organizations can't be parties to class actions. So that rules out a whole bunch of litigants who are bringing these claims against the administration. And the court has, at least since the 2010s, limited the scope of class actions by making it harder for class actions to be certified, certainly in some group of class actions that are available. And so it's just not going to be this widespread panacea that I think George claims, although I think there may be some cases where it could be very useful, but it will not be as effective in checking this administration in the way the universal injunction was.
Your co-panelists are doing a lot of nods, and I'm going to turn it over to them. I just want to add a couple quick things. First, I did mention that conversation, Melissa, but I did a piece on this. It was all over the lot. You could find definitely representatives of the no big deal view and representatives of the catastrophe view. And that in itself was, I think, really provocative. And I agree.
I've noticed that the no big deal view is very male-centered and the catastrophe view is often a lot of ladies. So
that's so interesting. Like, I should reconsider my manhood then, because I've been on the other.
I'm closer to the latter, just for the record.
Yeah, but let me just say that's
Steve is a man with a good personality.
You're the strongest woman we know.
You guys are an obstreperous bunch today. Let me just say, I totally agree with your analysis. And I think that's the real difference when you focus on Trump himself. It's by orders of magnitude, not just a little bit, both the incidents and the departure from constitutional law that his various executive orders have done. So a lot of nods, and I want to serve it up to Leah and Steve, but in particular, the no big deal thesis does depend in some sense on, well, we can get around it. And we've had a new interesting suggestion just this morning from a friend of the podcast, In Just Security. People should file under the APA, which provides for a vacator of an unlawful executive order. So in addition to sort of assessing how bad it is, if you could give me your impression about whether, like Melissa, you think the various stratagems to get around it are not so promising. And I'll just add one thing, which is look at Alito's opinion or just think of the court. There was a real sense of like jealousy or possessiveness or this is for us, not for you guys. And so if that's the case, even if people have stumbled on a good legal stratagem for workaround, will the court abide it?
Yeah, so I'm very much in agreement with Melissa, and I think a lot remains to be seen about what exactly these exceptions will amount to. I think based on past practice, the Roberts Court has an unfortunate history of saying, don't worry, this decision isn't going to be that bad because there's this great other remedy. Whether that's in the Voting Rights Act context, whether that's in the context of the exclusionary rule, whether that's in the context of post-conviction review, like you name it. And so we have yet to see whether these exceptions will be more real than hypothetical and based on their hostility to class actions and the fact that they didn't say nationwide relief is necessary here to address the harms to the state. When it's clear that that is true, those are worrying signs. On the APA bit, the Administrative Procedure Act cause of action does not run against the president. It doesn't apply to all executive orders. And I think holding that out as a possible remedy in the context of this administration, which has taken, I think, a charitable word would be stingy view about the scope of lower courts' injunctions, such that their position is if the defendant is the Department of Homeland Security, that doesn't stop the Department of Defense from carrying out removals that would be barred by an order that runs against the Department of Homeland Security. APA relief is not necessarily going to be an adequate substitute, and it absolutely is not going to cover every single policy that nationwide injunctions could have been used against. But I think in some ways, like the most problematic aspect of this case is the different discretion the Supreme Court exercised not to review the merits, to decide the issue in the context of this case, because what that does is it sends a message to the administration that at least some of their attacks and their resistance to the lower courts are onto something. They gave them a win in a case where a win was not at all justified. They did not deserve it. And I worry that that is just going to embolden the administration's defiance of lower court orders, their resistance to the prospect of judicial oversight, and also their egregious legal violations. Again, this is a case where the administration's lawfulness is just completely obvious for anyone to see.
So I would just add 3 very quick points on top of Leah and Melissa. I mean, I think I'm sort of 90% of the way to Melissa's view of this scenario, which is, 10% short, but that's norm for me.
Short is often a word people describe you as, Steve.
I know. So one other piece of context that I think the sort of the Will Bode, Sam Bray brigade have remarkably left out of this story is that this very same Supreme Court had 2 golden opportunities to limit universal injunctions in January, in cases that were not politically fraught, in cases that would have shown that their real concern is procedural, in cases where it would not have been kneecapping lower federal courts systematically, but rather would have been setting them on the right course right at the beginning of a new administration as opposed to in the middle of this. And the court didn't take either of those cases. What changed between January and March, I wonder, right? And funny how the folks who are defending this decision have no real explanation for that.
And the court itself issued the question presented to everyone saying, we want to hear just this one, not the merits of birthright citizenship. Right?
Well, but right. But so that gets me to my second point, which is, I am not the biggest fan of nationwide injunctions. I've been very critical of them for some time. But the way Justice Barrett goes about limiting them is so sloppy. I'm usually a fan of her analyses, even when I disagree with them. This has to be one of her laziest opinions because among other things, it does not deal with the question of how the federal government is irreparably harmed by a policy that is never going to go into effect, by blocking a policy that everyone thinks is never going to, like, what is the harm of the government from blocking an executive order that is never going to go into effect? Not discussed. Why the states weren't entitled to the relief that they were seeking because they needed it for complete relief, per Leah's point, not discussed. The administration's argument that the states should also not be plaintiffs in these cases because they don't have standing, not discussed. And it's like, if you're going to actually do it right. So when, folks sing the praises of her opinion, I'm trying to figure out what opinion they've read. The court is promising to provide what Kavanaugh calls a nationally uniform interim rule in a case in which the court failed to provide a nationally uniform interim rule. And so anyone who tries to sell this decision as being a work of logical coherence versus putting a knife in the back of something that should have been killed a long time ago is just trying to sell something.
And I did want to follow up on just that with Leah and Melissa, because among the other sort of striking disparities of opinion, we have Justice Jackson writing, the majority's approach presents an existential threat to the rule of law in our country. And Barrett seems to, she's pretty dismissive, maybe a little insulting to Jackson.
Yes.
But also
a scold, if you will.
I'm the damn host here. I'll characterize it as I will. You may comment on it. That's the way it works.
I'm the captain now.
Harry, you sound like Justice Barrett.
Well, that actually is what I wanted to ask you about, because look, I think we all agree sort of implicitly. There's a problem here they were addressing. In the thing I just wrote, I called it the Kazmarek problem, and I don't think we have to spell that out anymore. But there were many things they could have done that, as Melissa says, in particularly acute or unlawful or costly situations would have permitted some nationwide injunctions. And I just want to add to Leah's point, it's not just the signal that they send to the administration. There could be a couple years during which I agree, unlawful regime kind of holds sway and creates all kinds of messes. So I just want to give you guys a chance to talk specifically about the cogency of Barrett's legal analysis.
I'll start. I read this opinion and I too wonder about the people praising it, because it is totally disconnected from the very real issues that nationwide injunctions present, which is their overuse, their abuse, right? Saying that Congress wrote this law in 1789 and at the time federal courts didn't issue them does not begin to track what the problem with nationwide injunctions is. It's totally divorced from context and issue. Second is its exceptions. I don't understand how they follow, because she says, oh, by the way, there was this equitable tradition, but federal courts didn't issue nationwide injunctions when this law was enacted in 1789, therefore no nationwide injunctions. But also there's this equitable principle that courts get to afford parties complete relief, and therefore maybe states can get them. And it's like, okay, well, why wouldn't nationwide relief sometimes be appropriate for individuals, especially when you're talking about an executive order that traffics in great replacement theory? Like, newsflash, if there's going to be an executive order that should be enjoined on a nationwide basis because it's going to affect everyone, maybe that's going to be one of them. Also, the unwillingness to clarify, what the scope of the exceptions is very unsatisfying, and the decision not to take up the merits, that's its own thing. And I don't understand the method of analysis. It is both freewheeling, also tied to history. It is fundamentally different than the pragmatic analysis the court used in the immunity decision. The court is all over the place, and I think in ways that evince they are kind of in the bag for Donald Trump.
I'll just say, this purports to be, I think, a kind of ersatz originalism. And I think it reveals all of the ways in which originalism is really, or should be, subject to intense skepticism and just real critique. She starts off with the notion that we don't have a history of universal injunctions. And I guess that's right. We don't have a history, though, of presidents having this much authority. We don't have a
presidents repealing Section 1 of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, we don't have a history of that. We actually, the idea of government in the form that it exists today probably would not be recognizable to the framers, which is not to say it's not authorized by the Constitution. But if everything is going to be like, what did James Madison think about this? much of our government is going to be unconstitutional under an originalist logic. And she really doesn't grapple with that at all. The only use that originalism has here is to get to the conclusion that universal injunctions are self-evidently wrong, unconstitutional, exceed the power of the federal courts, and should just be stopped, full stop. There's nothing about, the role of government, the role of this executive, the expansive nature of executive power, which would also have been anathema to the framers. It's just a very kind of cheap and skimpy and itinerant originalist logic, and it ought to be called out as such. I will say that I was surprised to see her writing this opinion. This is an extraordinary assignment for a relatively junior justice. It is the kind of thing that I think ordinarily the Chief Justice would have reserved for himself. And, I don't know why she got this. I will say it certainly lays to rest the fawning profile of her that appeared in the New York Times just a few weeks earlier. If her concurrence in Skirmetti didn't just sort of kill the view that she's some kind of suitor-like fairy who's going to grant all the liberals their most heartfelt wishes and dreams, she nailed that coffin down with a bang with this opinion. So I don't know what else to say. Justice Barrett is going to Justice Barrett, and it seems like part of Justice Barretting is a kind of faithless originalism coupled with a little schoolmarm scolding.
Which might explain in part the actual assignment. And by the way, I just think this is one of the differences between 5 and 6. She's able, when she wants to, just not even really wrestle and just be dismissive, as we've all agreed, on the Jackson opinion. But this is a perfect segue to Steve's point about the Kavanaugh concurrence, which you called the most telling single opinion from the term.
Because he tells on himself.
Well, it can be fairly read to stand for the proposition that the court will do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, never mind the procedural formalities that might get in its way. But Steve, talk to us about the importance of the Kavanaugh concurrence and what it augurs.
I take the Kavanaugh concurrence to be Brett Kavanaugh telling us what he's been doing on emergency applications for the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. And what I find striking about it is a couple of things. First, he sets it up as a response to critics who he won't name and whose criticisms he won't actually cite.
Their name's Steve Vladeck.
I'm one of them. I think that's clear. Which is a problem because he actually misdescribes what the critiques are and then, knocks down straw men. But the broader point, Harry, is he takes what actually is a plausible argument in the abstract. The notion that the real question in all of these cases is, should there be a nationally uniform interim rule during the time it takes for one of these cases to get to the Supreme Court? And if so, who should provide it? That's actually, I think, a helpful framing of the problem. It's just his answer that's really incoherent, because his answer is, yes, there usually should be, and yes, the answer should come from us, but apparently except not in this case.
24/7, 365. The Supreme Court never sleeps.
Right, which, by the way, is a hilarious shot at Jim Ho, right? the 24/7, 365 line is actually, I think, in some respects, a indirect or even direct response to Judge Ho saying that the district courts aren't open all night like a Denny's. And Kavanaugh's like, yes, they are. So, in an abstract world, the Kavanaugh opinion actually has a lot to say for it. There are two problems. The first is he doesn't follow his own opinion in this case because he joins a majority opinion that doesn't actually provide a nationally uniform interim rule. And the second is, and this is where I want to go back to what Melissa said, what is so maddening about the methodology in the majority opinion is that it's hyper-formalist until it's not. And Kavanaugh signs on to a hyper-formalist decision and then writes a concurrence that is incredibly, entirely pragmatic and functional. And my favorite example of this, I'm sorry to be very specific, is footnote 3, where, again, responding to unidentified critics who have been complaining for years that the Supreme Court has conflated the standards for a stay and an injunction pending appeal, he says, well, actually, it kind of practically makes sense that we should apply the same standard to those things. Never mind decades of precedent holding that because those different types of emergency relief come from different statutory sources, they require different showings. Formalism's central problem. There is a prominent law professor I will not name who once lost me in his entry-level interview because he was willing to go only so far with his formalism. And it's like, if he wanted to go all the way, I would have loved him, right? But he was like, all right, well, I'm formalist to a point. And I'm like, well, no, then you're not a formalist. And neither is the Supreme Court. And that's the problem. Like, Kavanaugh's opinion basically lays bare just how completely untethered to a coherent analytical or methodological principle the majority opinion is.
And what's a conclave like this without citing favorite footnotes? And I'm just going to serve up number 18 from the majority, where they say, oh, it's okay because the SG says we don't have to worry. They'll actually be trying to bring things up. I know that Leah and Melissa are going to weigh in here. I just want to add the obvious, which is what his opinion and insistence that the Supreme Court alone gives the nationwide solution portends is a proliferation of more and more and more emergency DACA with all those friggin' problems that were enormous this year.
So for a majority opinion that bemoaned the prospect of an imperial judiciary, it's really rich for Brett Kavanaugh to be like, no, I'm the imperial judiciary. And that's essentially what this
I'm the
is.
empire. The empire strikes back.
Yeah, I'm the emperor. But that's actually not surprising. It's probably the least surprising thing about this set of opinions, because this court has, at least for the last 3 years, been steadily arrogating power to itself. It is principally done so, I think, in the context of stripping power from agencies. But here, I think they're being very clear that they're also willing to strip power from the lower courts. And I think it is incredibly significant that the two dissents that call this out are written by the only two members of the court who have ever been federal trial judges. And say what you want about judicial qualifications, but I think it's a real problem that everyone in this conservative supermajority, if they have been a judge, it's only been on a federal appellate court. They have no idea what trial courts do. We see that over and over again in their decisions and oral arguments, especially in voting rights cases where you have trial courts wrestling with the record and dealing with experts. They have no idea what trial courts are doing. They're happy to second guess trial judges at every turn. And I think with this decision, they have cemented the view that the president and his ilk continue to farm out, that trial judges are nothing more than partisan hacks who are just getting in the way. And in doing so, they contribute to the incredible danger that so many of these trial court judges face right now in this moment.
And I would just add really quickly, I know we've been focused on the birthright citizenship holding, but last week also saw the court's grant of emergency relief in the DVD case, the third country removals case, where without any regard to the merits, like the federal government defied two different orders by the district court. And the Supreme Court's like, yeah, whatever, stay granted. And so this is why, I wrote in my newsletter on Monday that, this is a new kind of judicial supremacy. Melissa's documented this. Leah's documented this. We've known for a couple of years that this court is not afraid of its shadow vis-a-vis any other institution of government, but now that includes the lower courts. And the hubris of the majority opinion implicitly and the Kavanaugh opinion explicitly, I think are part of why when, folks look at critiques like mine or Melissa's or Leah's and say that they're, overreacting, I say, well, no, you are underreacting to what's really happening in this case, right? You are basically taking the Supreme Court's decision as a press release and not actually examining seriously what's happening behind the scenes and how this is going to affect what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, I was going to say, for all the people who say we have overreacted, Leah and I have never been wrong yet. Full stop.
Yeah, as far as seriously, warning, this
stop.
one's going to go poorly. So the few things that I was just going to add, one is, as Brett Kavanaugh is announcing, I am the imperial judiciary, I was imagining the Empire Strikes Back music playing in the background. Also, not only did the justices give the administration relief from DVD, the lower court order that the administration defied, they also gave the administration relief from JGG, the Judge Boasberg order that had directed the administration to turn the planes around, another order that the administration has defied. And the idea that the Supreme Court is now going to be making all of these decisions, Brett Kavanaugh is on the shadow docket, as he's been doing doing all along, that is just going to spell more inconsistency, more lack of explanation, and more confusion, as the lower courts are trying to figure out, what are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to signal, when they are not being consistent or even bothering to explain themselves?
I think there's no way around that this was a really conservative juggernaut year, and the six did what they wanted and showed little interest in finding ground for compromise with the three who, were a dissenting cohort, especially at the end. So we've highlighted already the executive power cases. Then there were also all these hot button social issues that I want to leave a few minutes for. Let me start with Leah and Melissa, because you had a great discussion on strict scrutiny of how the Mahmoud v. Taylor ruling presents, in your view, a huge threat to the functioning of public education. Can you sort of spell that out?
So what I was going to start with is actually a little bit of a different aspect to the decision than you averted to, Harry, which is like the homophobia on display in the opinion. I mean, Justice Alito's majority opinion depicts the inclusion of LGBT instructional material, storybooks with LGBT characters, as an objective danger and threat to parents' ability to inculcate in their children their religious beliefs. He singles out as problematic the instruction, the guidance to teachers that told teachers, if a student uses the word gay as a slur, point out how that can be hurtful. The idea, right, that is somehow an attack on individuals, but like using the word gay as a slur or trans bashing individuals is not, I think, gives a lie to what is really at work in this decision. You add to that the separate writings of the justices in the Scarametti case, in which Justices Alito, Thomas, and Barrett went further to say, well, even if this law did discriminate against trans people, I would be fine with it. So in some ways, I think one of the most concerning aspects of these decisions is their increasing willingness to depict the LGBT community, like not as a community, not as people, but like as an ideology that they can just like fight and stamp out and trammel over.
And witness their vacating several cases just after the term that had to do with trans rights on the basis of Scarametti, right?
Exactly. After they insisted in Scarametti that this is a narrow case that is just about a healthcare ban for minors, about a specific medical procedure, and the law still allows trans kids to access hormones and puberty blockers for other reasons, they then go ahead and vacate a ton of lower court decisions that have nothing to do with healthcare bans and instead involve like different forms of discrimination against the transgender community and say, well, actually, maybe our decision might affect them after all.
So I will reiterate in slightly different terms what Leah said. I mean, essentially, this is constitutionalizing a heckler's veto in the context of public education. But mostly, I think it's going to be a heckler's veto for Christian conservatives. Here, the parents happened to be Muslim and Ethiopian Orthodox, but I think more often this case is likely going to be marshaled by those who hold more traditional evangelical Christian views. And I think they're going to find a very receptive court when those claims percolate up. I actually would be interested to see how this plays out in the context of other religions. Because the point here is just sort of mere exposure to something makes it harder for parents to instill their religious beliefs in their children. So if the school cafeteria is serving, for example, bacon cheeseburgers, are Jewish parents going to be able to say, like, that's just too much exposure? We can't do Judaism at home if, our son sees Bobby eating the bacon cheeseburger. By the same token, maybe there are Hindu parents who are like, the bacon cheeseburger, forget the bacon part, it's the cheeseburger part that we're concerned with. I think this is going to make it almost impossible to operate a public school system, unless you're just going to say this is really only for Christian conservatives, which I kind of think it might be. But it's just basically an avenue to fly spec every aspect of the curriculum. If you look at the underlying motives for the Montgomery County School District to make these changes in their curriculum, it was because they recognized that they had a very diverse and pluralistic community, and they wanted to make sure that their curriculum reflected the diversity of those families. I think a very well-intentioned view. You're not going to see any school districts doing anything like that. We're going to go back to the great books, the so-called canon. Because you can make an objection about anything. Like Zora Neale Hurston. I don't think it's good for my daughter to be exposed to that because our religious belief is that premarital sex violates our religion. And some of the characters in that book, their eyes are watching God, are engaged in premarital sex or sex outside of marriage. And so no to that. You're just going to have just the kind of curriculum that we had in the 1950s. And I think that's by design. And you raised the point about, what I said about Brown versus Board of Education. I don't even remember what I said about Brown versus Board of Education or any of the other cases other than segregationists relied heavily on religious tropes to oppose segregation in the 1950s. In the opinion in Loving versus Virginia, which was written in 1967, the court notes that the trial court in Virginia made clear that it believed that the Almighty God had put the races on different continents because God did not believe in race mixing. And for that reason, the state of Virginia's view that race mixing was a criminal act was fine. So we have seen this before. I think we are likely to see it again. But I think here the purpose has been to hobble public education, which at least for the last 50 years has been the means by which we have inculcated a set of civic values that trend toward pluralism.
I want to try to maybe expand this a bit beyond even Mahmoud, because I actually think this is a theme that cuts across almost all of the, for lack of a better word, social policy decisions the court handed down, which is, we want to provide more of an ability for ourselves, the Supreme Court, to decide which things we like and which things we don't like. And so, Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton is a really good example of this, where, a majority waters down to intermediate scrutiny what for decades has been understood to be a strict scrutiny test where, listen, no one's a fan of making it easy for kids to access sexually explicit content on the internet. But if it's, if the state has a compelling interest and if there's no less restrictive alternative, it should survive strict scrutiny, right? We don't water down the scrutiny for everybody because we really, really, really want this law to be upheld.
And it regularly has.
Right? And so it gives the view, there's that 2018 meme, conservatism consists of exactly one proposition. There must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, and out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. That's all of these decisions, which is we're going to realign doctrine. We are going to move precedent so that we can strike down the things that are bad to us and uphold the things that are not bad to us. And the problem is that as defensible as that might be in the abstract, it's going to cause chaos in the lower courts because the lower courts don't have the luxury of denying certiorari in the case that really poses a complication for your view of doctrine. The lower courts have to take these doctrinal moves seriously. The last thing I would just throw in, the nerdiest part of the court's docket this term, all of these venue cases that I think have not gotten a lot of attention are actually the exact same thing, where the court over and over again, when it was about making it easier for conservative litigants to pick and choose where to bring their challenges to federal policies, the court was pro broad venue or pro standing. And where it's about litigants challenging this administration or, otherwise litigants who are likely to be progressive, no. And so it's we don't mind that the busiest source of cases for us this term was the Fifth Circuit. Bring us the Fifth Circuit cases because we'll either agree with them or we won't, and then we'll look good. And it is such a sort of just a callous, I don't even know what other adjectives to describe. It's I wrote this in my newsletter on Monday. It's what Leah's been saying for years. It's no law, it's just vibes.
One quick comment, and then I want to set up a final discussion. And that is, this is what you said, actually, Melissa, but it's the perfect point, the notion of a heckler's veto. We, in case after case, have seen people's views that are against certain groups as being discrimination, but they've really accepted from that there's some kind of free exercise claim when it's religion that's being proffered. And I agree that as a practical matter, it's going to be largely the evangelical community that will be making it, like the two cake shop cases. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we unbottle the truth about wine. Is there really a right or a wrong way to enjoy it? Wine drinkers near and far have lived by a certain set of written yet unofficial rules to follow, particularly when it comes to pairing wine and food. You've heard a couple of them before. White wine pairs with seafood, red wine pairs with big old juicy steaks. And while we like to think of these more as guidelines than rules, some suggestions actually do serve a higher purpose to help your wine get the most from your dish, and vice versa. One pairing that's not quite as obvious involves tannins. Tannins are the dryness that you taste and feel in wine. They come from grape seeds, skin, or oak barrels. Traditionally, high tannin wines and spicy foods don't pair well together. The dry components of the wine become more pronounced with spice, which makes the food itself taste even hotter than it actually is. From drinking red wine with fish to white wine with beef, we say you do you. But there is one no-no that we wholeheartedly live by. Always, yes, always, hold your glass by the stem and not the bulb. And there are a few reasons why. Putting your warm hands on the bulb transfers unnecessary heat to the wine. As wine warms up, it will become off balance and you will taste the alcohol more and more. Not to mention, you can easily avoid smudges to your beautiful glassware. To truly enjoy wine, you can never go wrong pairing the wonderful selection and helpful guides at Total Wine & More. Cheers.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's spirited debate. So much to talk about in just this term, but here's what I want to set up. Get your views about basically, will the court hold? Because until a few weeks ago, I would say, it seemed to me that the court had had a lot of terrible decisions and they had set back doctrine in a lot of ways and they were going to do it. But by far the most important thing is holding the line on judicial review in the Alien Enemy Act cases and holding 7-2 at one point, 9-0 on another, that the determination of whether a statute applies, in that case, the notion of predatory incursion or foreign nation, was for the judiciary to decide. And that to me was a very kind of reassuring, even in the wake of all this other wreckage, sign that the court understood when we were really at an existential line and that it would push back and police. But now, and what scares me so much about the Ninth Circuit opinion is if it gives a lot of room in the joints for so-called deference to decide. And remember, the administration's position was, you can't review it all. If I'd say because it's Tuesday, that's good enough. We had an argument yesterday in the Fifth Circuit where a Trump appointee was making a similar claim. Do you think we are out of the woods or not on this gravest danger of handing Trump true authoritarian powers by giving him an ability to invoke emergency where he says, as he says, and without judicial scrutiny?
No. I will elaborate. Just wanted to start with the top line there. One of the reasons is I'm going to invoke something Steve's post at one first alluded to, which is the Supreme Court seemingly going back on one of their major due process decisions in the Alien Enemies Act context on the third country removal decision. Because remember, in the Alien Enemies Act cases, the Supreme Court said 24 hours notice without indicating how to challenge your potential expulsion was inadequate. But then in the third country removal case, the government had provided just 16 hours notice overnight that did not inform individuals about their ability to challenge their possible removal, and the Supreme Court stayed that lower court decision. So to my mind, I always thought that and this is, I'm just going to say with the benefit of hindsight, I was right, even though I'm not sure exactly where I stake this up position, but I was right. Okay.
Well, it's already been established. You and Melissa have yet to be wrong.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Because the AARP decision, as well as, the other Alien Enemies Act reasoning that indicated the Supreme Court had to review the matter, to my mind, that was a crisis of the Supreme Court's own making. They were the ones that blocked the Judge Boasberg ruling and then allowed the government to try to shuttle these people out overnight. And when the government was doing that, it was in defiance of what the Supreme Court had said and also potentially eliminating the Supreme Court's ability to weigh in on the propriety of these removals. The Supreme Court is not okay with the executive branch challenging their authority. They are fine fine with the executive branch giving the middle finger to the lower courts. And that was actually the third point that I had originally wanted to, that I will end with now, which is, if you think back to the Chief Justice's statement after President Trump was railing against Judge Boasberg and suggesting he should be impeached, the Chief Justice said the solution for decisions you don't like isn't impeachment, it's appellate review. The administration officials, right, who have testified before Congress have said, oh, they're evading questions about whether they would respect a lower court order, but of course we'd never defy the Supreme Court. And I feel like the understanding is the Trump administration knows the Supreme Court largely has their back, and the Supreme Court has largely signaled it has the Trump administration's back. And so the two of them, the administration and the Supreme Court, are fine minimizing the power of the lower courts and basically both engaged in an attack on the lower courts. And that is, I think, some of what I see even in the good decisions that have emerged. And so I absolutely do not think we are out of the woods of this court handing Donald Trump the kind of authoritarian powers that would absolutely be just breaking of all semblance of the rule of law. And that's why my answer was no.
I'll just say, I agree with everything Leah said. The two things that I think are really critical here is it is possible that the Supreme Court will find its backbone, that John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, and maybe even Brett Kavanaugh, will actually look at what's happening with the Trump presidency and say, okay, and their rulings so far this term have left them plenty of room to find their backbone. I mean, for all of the emergency relief the court has granted to the Trump administration, it has blessed the merits in exactly one of those cases, in Wilcox, about the firing of members of the NLRB and MSPB. The problem is that it's like, Lucy moving on the football in Charlie Brown, right? Every single time someone asks us to have faith in this court to do the right thing, they disappoint us. And I don't think that last Friday's ruling was the end of the rule of law in the United States, but I could imagine a universe in which we look back at it as a sign that this court is just not going to be there when we need it to be there. I think DVD, the third country removal case, is going to end up being a huge deal because of the behavior it enabled and the lack of pushback it signaled that the court was going to provide. And so the problem, Harry, is that a lot can happen between now and next term. And a lot can happen that actually has us sitting here a year from now saying, actually, the court, left itself room to get a lot of these big cases right. But the court also left itself room to get a lot of these big cases wrong. And it did so in a way that is going to only make it easier for the president and his supporters to attack district judges, only going to make it harder for those district judges to do their job. And at a time when district courts have proven to be just about the only check on rampant lawlessness by the president, it seems like that should be the last thing the Supreme Court is doing, not the first.
I was just thinking about what Steve said about the court just perennially disappointing us. Basically, this is the Ben Affleck of courts, just always disappointing. I think you also have to hold out the prospect here that this is a court that recognizes that it doesn't have any real means of enforcing a substantive decision against this administration. I think that's always sort of looming over all of this. What if this administration gives the court the finger? And I think that drives a lot of what they're doing. These procedural wins that lay the foundation for more excessive behavior and maybe some nods to substance, nods to the rule of law. They say the right things sometimes, and then they don't say those things in other cases. But I think a lot of this is this court recognizes that we are in uncharted waters, that this is a president that has big DGAF energy. And when the rubber hits the road, this administration probably isn't going to listen to this court if the court goes against it in a really clear and broad way in a case where it matters.
So, wow. But I think that hypothesis is certainly more plausible than the one that the court is just clueless and doesn't understand the implications. I think they know when they're really hitting the cliff.
Well, can I also say something about that, Harry?
Sure.
I mean, I think there are at least 3 members of this court who don't think there's anything wrong with what the administration is doing. And what you're really grappling with is there are 3 others who are like, this is really bad. They're probably not going to listen to us. And there's, I think, some infighting within the conservative bloc over what to do about this administration. And maybe this is sort of the detente that they have come up with, but I don't know how long this holds. And I don't know that it holds for 4 years.
And it's also not a detente that is going to prevent a descent into authoritarianism, right? Like the Supreme Court holding out the possibility of preserving their own power because this administration won't comply with an order. What are you holding out for?
Right. I mean, the term I keep coming back to with this line of thought that what's going on is sort of the concern about the political pressure is then it's appeasement. It's not constitutional law. It's just appeasement. And I don't think we have to look very hard to figure out what the central problem with appeasement is, which is it tends not to actually make the bully stop bullying. And the nice part of the story, if it's a nice part of the story, is the appeasement that the British government was willing to engage in 1938 did not prevent the British people from going to war in 1939. The downside is they had to go to war. I worry about if it's conscious, it seems incredibly dangerous. If it's subconscious, it seems incredibly unprincipled. But whatever it is not based on any coherent, articulated theory of the Supreme Court's rule in our constitutional system, or one that anyone should actually want to aspire to. And so I think Melissa's right, the détente isn't going to hold. I think it probably won't even hold through the end of next term, because sooner or later, the court's going to actually have to start saying something about these policies on their merits.
Right. People don't realize we literally haven't gotten to the merits on. We're just getting to them now. Yeah.
Well, and so where are the Chief and Kavanaugh and Barrett when the rubber hits the road on birthright citizenship or on due process for migrants or on tariffs? I mean, on any number of other things where on unilateral uses of force, although I'm not excited about that, on domestic use of the military. I mean, let's just pick your poison. Like, are there 2 votes from that 3-justice block? And, listen, maybe I'm Charlie Brown here. I think there actually might be, but I think that the court has done absolutely nothing this term to disabuse the Trump administration of the notion that it should keep pushing and that it loses nothing by pushing.
So we have 3 no votes if the question is, are we out of the woods? So everyone thinks we're very much in the woods.
I mean, Taylor Swift also votes that way, too. Are we out of the woods? Are we out of the woods? Are we out of the woods? So, nope.
Somehow there's always a popular culture reference. But I'll say that, so we now have to say thanks very much to our 3 New York Times best-selling authors of awesome books, maybe some of which will be on Talking Feds to come. But this is the question I wanted to focus on. And as Brett Kavanaugh says, 24/7, 365, the accumulating evidence of where they are doesn't stop between now and the first Monday in October, because with this weird, I'll start there, determination that lower judicial courts don't have the judicial power that the court does, we're going to see all kinds of emergency motions come that way. Melissa, Leah, Steve, on that not so sanguine note, we say we bid you until the next time. Thank you so much, Leah, Melissa, and Steve. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this episode. You can also now subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Or check us out on Substack at Talking Feds Substack, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, breaking down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law, and also doing weekly Q&A sessions and Is It Legal explanations. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so it's your support and nothing else that funds all of our franchises. And Talking Feds has now joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to that new media venture, committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than policy ones. Rest assured, we're still the same scrappy, independent podcast you've come to know and trust, just now linked up with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourse. You can find out more at contrarian.substack.com, where you can also find a special posting of each week's Talking Feds Roundtable. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Associate producers Luke Cregan, Becca Havian, and Katie Upshaw. Sound engineering by Matt McGardle, Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. And production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Litman. Talk to you later.